Welcome back. It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome to a brand new series on the Essex Boys case. In this upcoming series, we're going to be taking a look at some information which has recently been released into the public domain concerning potential new eyewitness accounts, Michael Steele's own thoughts on the crime scene and the investigation into the murders themselves, and also the in-depth testing surrounding the mobile phone usage of both the victims and the accused. Firstly, let's take a look at the background surrounding the case in question. Background. Point 1. Mr. Womes faced trial with 2 co-defendants Michael Steele and Peter Corey on an indictment with 5 counts. Count 1, to which all 3 men were defendants, alleged that they had conspired to import cannabis. Counts 2, 3 and 4 related to the murders of 3 men. Patrick Tate, Anthony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. Mr. Womes and Mr. Steele were charged with the murders, but Mr. Corey was not. Count 5 related to the possession as a prohibited person of a shotgun. Mr. Steele was the only defendant to this charge. The prosecution case. Point 2. The Crown's case, in relation to all the counts, relied very heavily on the evidence of Darren Nichols. He was an accomplice to the importation of drugs and was involved in the events surrounding the murders. By consent, the jury was directed to take account of his criminal character and his admitted involvement in the importation of controlled drugs. The jury were directed that in giving evidence for the Crown, Mr. Nichols may well have had an interest of his own to serve in seeking to obtain some lesser sentence than would otherwise be the case. He had lied in his 3rd interview with the police. Mr. Nichols had previously pleaded guilty to and was awaiting sentence upon 4 counts on an indictment relating to the importation of drugs, the sale of a firearm and the possession of drugs. Point 3. Mr. Nichols said that in 1992 he had been in prison for counterfeiting offences. Whilst in prison, he befriended the defendants Mr. Steele and Mr. Womes. In 1993, Patrick Tate moved to the same prison. Mr. Nichols and Mr. Steele already knew him. Mr. Nichols said that he subsequently contacted Mr. Steele and Mr. Tate when they had all been released from prison. In 1994, after they had been released, Mr. Nichols had come to dislike Mr. Tate and they had no longer been on speaking terms. Mr. Nichols carried out some electrical work at a house in Clacton that belonged to Mr. Steele's mother. Around this time, Mr. Nichols said he began to sell cannabis resin for Mr. Steele. He also did some work for Mr. Steele in Brightlingsea, where he, Steele, had a rigid inflatable boat. Mr. Nichols thought that Mr. Steele also disliked Mr. Tate. Drug smuggling. Point 4. Mr. Nichols gave evidence in relation to several trips abroad that he made with Mr. Steele, Mr. Womes, Mr. Corey and others. The first trip was on the 15th of August 1995. He collected Mr. Steele and Mr. Corey and they went together in a car via the ferry at Felixstowe to Amsterdam. There they met a man named Stone, who agreed to sell them a quantity of drugs. They left the money with Mr. Stone and returned to the UK. Point 5. Mr. Nichols and Mr. Corey returned to Amsterdam a few days later to collect the drugs. They went by car via the ferry to Ostend in Belgium. When they left Amsterdam, they telephoned Mr. Steele in the UK. They arranged to meet Mr. Steele on the coast near Blankenberg. Mr. Steele travelled from the UK in his rib. When Mr. Steele arrived, Mr. Nichols and Mr. Corey carried the drugs down the beach and loaded them onto the boat. Mr. Steele and Mr. Corey returned to the UK in the boat. Mr. Nichols telephoned Mr. Womes to tell him that the boat was on its way back before returning to the UK by car via Calais. He was subsequently paid in drugs by Mr. Steele for his part in the importation. Point 6. Mr. Nichols said that on the 3rd of October 1995, he and another man, Francis Reed, went to Amsterdam, crossing the channel by ferry from Felixstowe to Zeebrugge. Mr. Nichols said that Mr. Reed did not know at the outset that the purpose of the trip was to purchase and smuggle cannabis. Mr. Nichols bought cannabis from Mr. Stone. He then met Mr. Steele on the coast near Blankenberg. The boat was again loaded with the drugs. Mr. Nichols said that he was then told by Mr. Steele that he would be returning with him, Steele, on the boat. Mr. Reed returned to the UK by ferry. Mr. Nichols said that the crossing in the boat was difficult. The sea was rough and the fuel tank on the boat split. They landed at Point Clear in Essex, where they were then met by Mr. Womes. Mr. Nichols was again paid in drugs for his part in this importation. Point 7. On the 7th of November 1995, Mr. Nichols again went to Holland with Mr. Corey. This importation involved the purchase of drugs to the value of £125,000. The money came from various sources, including Patrick Tate. Mr. Nichols said that he had collected Mr. Corey from Mr. Steele's house, where the cash for the purchase was being counted. They travelled from Harwich to Amsterdam as foot passengers and later hired a car in Amsterdam. They handed the money to Mr. Stone and then met him to collect the drugs. They drove to the same beach near Blankenberg. Mr. Steele picked up the drugs in the boat. Mr. Corey returned to the UK with Mr. Steele in the boat. The following day, Mr. Nichols returned to the UK through Harwich. Mr. Nichols said that he subsequently learned from Mr. Steele that he, Steele, Mr. Womes and Mr. Corey had been arrested by the police and customs officers when Mr. Steele had landed at Point Clear. The boat had been searched, but nothing was found because the drugs had already been offloaded. The three men had been questioned and released. Point 8. Mr. Steele took Mr. Nichols to where the drugs had been stored and gave him several kilograms to sell. Mr. Nichols passed the drugs on to dealers, but they returned them to him, saying that the cannabis was of very poor quality and was unsaleable. Mr. Steele said that he had heard the same thing from other people to whom he had supplied the drugs. Mr. Steele contacted Mr. Stone, who apologised and said that they had been given the wrong batch, although a third of the drugs were of good quality. He agreed to refund the money if the drugs were returned. Point 9. On the 15th of November 1995, Mr. Nichols went with Mr. Steele to Amsterdam to collect the money. Mr. Stone initially gave them £30,000 and they agreed to wait whilst he obtained the rest of the refund. They stayed overnight in the Delta Hotel. On the 17th of November, Mr. Stone provided them with a further 80,000 of guilders, which Mr. Steele accepted. Mr. Steele was concerned about carrying large amounts of currency back into the UK and made telephone calls to persuade Mr. Tate, Mr. Womes and others to travel to Ostend to help take the money back. Mr. Steele met Mr. Tate and two women and gave them some of the money. Mr. Womes came over in a van and took the guilders back to the UK. Mr. Steele and Mr. Nichols returned to the UK by jet foil. Mr. Steele told Mr. Nichols to dispose of the cannabis and he did so by throwing it in the sandpits at Braintree. Point 10. The Crown adduced evidence to corroborate the account given by Mr. Nichols regarding the trips to Holland. There was evidence to show that a call had been made from a bar near the beach in Blankenberg to Mr. Womes' mobile telephone as Mr. Nichols had claimed. The ferry tickets in relation to the trip with Mr. Reed were paid for on Mr. Nichols' credit card and booked in Mr. Reed's name. There was an entry in an Amsterdam hotel register showing that Mr. Nichols had stayed there on the night of the 7th of November and again from the 15th to the 17th of November. There was a booking in Mr. Steele's name for a hotel in Ostend. The sandpits at Braintree were searched and blocks of cannabis resin were found. Point 11. Barry Dorman, a business associate of Mr. Tate's, gave evidence that he had gone to Ostend with him to collect money. Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker had also gone with them, as had some of their girlfriends. Point 12. Evidence was given as to the arrests of Mr. Steele, Mr. Womes and Mr. Corey on the night of the 7th/8th of November. In the early hours of the morning, police officers saw a Range Rover with a trailer and a rib attached. Mr. Wholmes spoke to the officers and said they had been diving. Mr. Corey and Mr. Steele appeared and began to do some work on the boat. Officers of HM Customs and Excise arrived and arrested Mr. Steele, Mr. Wholmes and Mr. Corey on suspicion of importing drugs. The boat was searched but nothing of significance was found. It was taken away for examination and a very small piece of cannabis resin weighing about 1/4 gram was found. Point 13. The three men were interviewed. Mr. Steele and Mr. Wholmes refused to answer any questions. Mr. Corey said he had been out with Mr. Steele to help him test the boat and its onboard computer. The boat, he said, had broken down on a number of occasions. The three men were released without charge. The murders. Point 14. Mr. Nichols said that on a number of occasions prior to the murders, Mr. Steele had asked him if he could get hold of a gun. On the 6th of December 1995, he had spoken to Mr. Steele on the telephone a number of times. He met him by arrangement at around 5 p.m. Mr. Wholmes was also present. Mr. Steele said he was going to collect some others and bring them to a place where a drug deal was to take place. Mr. Wholmes and Mr. Nichols went in a Volkswagen Passat to the car park of the Halfway House pub where Mr. Steele was already parked in his Toyota Hilux. They watched and saw a Range Rover arrive and park next to Mr. Steele's vehicle. Mr. Wholmes said that Mr. Tate was in the Range Rover. Mr. Wholmes then told Mr. Nichols to drive to Rettendon and turn off the road on a farm track to the right. Mr. Wholmes got out of the car there, taking a canvas bag with him. Mr. Wholmes told Mr. Nichols to wait for his telephone call and then come back and get him. Point 15. Mr. Nichols drove off to another pub to wait but could not obtain a good signal on his mobile telephone there, so he drove back past where he had dropped off Mr. Wholmes and parked in Rettendon. Mr. Wholmes telephoned and said, "Come and get us." Mr. Nichols returned to the farm track and Mr. Wholmes and then Mr. Steele got into the car. Mr. Wholmes was wearing plastic gloves which appeared to be speckled with blood. Mr. Steele told Mr. Nichols to drive off, which he did. Mr. Steele said, quote, "They won't fuck with us again," and Mr. Nichols assumed from this that someone had been killed. He saw Mr. Steele pass over parts of a shotgun to Mr. Wholmes. Mr. Steele described Mr. Wholmes as cold-hearted because Mr. Wholmes had handed Mr. Steele a gun and then Mr. Wholmes had immediately shot all three men in the Range Rover. Point 16. Mr. Nichols said that he learnt of the identity of the other two victims from the news. Mr. Steele told him sometime after the murders that the three men had been tempted to the scene by a story of a cocaine deal. The cocaine was to be imported by plane. Mr. Steele told him that the gun had been ground up and thrown into the sea. Mr. Steele said that Mr. Tate had borrowed some money from two brothers to buy the drugs and failed to repay it. He had told the brothers that Mr. Steele had not repaid him. Mr. Steele had heard that Mr. Tate had planned to deliver him to the brothers and to shoot him in front of them. Point 17. A few days after the murders, Mr. Nichols had been offered a shotgun and had agreed to buy it. He passed it on to Mr. Steele. A shotgun was later found by police hidden in a loft at Mr. Steele's house. Point 18. The bodies of the three victims were discovered in the Range Rover by two local farmers at around 7:45 on the morning of the 7th of December 1995. A forensic scientist gave evidence that he believed that 8 shots had been fired. 7 cartridge cases were recovered, all of which had come from the same weapon. Point 19. The Crown adduced evidence of telephone calls made between the telephones belonging to the parties from August 1995 until after the murders. Evidence was given regarding the location of mobile telephone transmitters and the routing of calls on the day of the murders. 2 calls were made from Mr. Wholmes' mobile telephone to Mr. Nichols' mobile telephone at 18:59. One call lasted only 1 second, indicating a poor signal. It was the Crown's case that the calls were made from the vicinity of Workhouse Lane, the site of the murders. The Crown brought forward evidence to show that the second call at 18:59, which lasted 4 seconds, was routed through a transmitter sited at Hockley, and that this was consistent with the call having been made in the Workhouse Lane area. Point 20. The court heard evidence in relation to the mobile telephones of the two victims, Patrick Tate and Anthony Tucker. The billing data for those telephones showed that the last calls they made were at 17:07, Tucker's mobile lasting 2 minutes and 9 seconds, and 18:26, Tate's mobile lasting 26 seconds. The billing data for Mr. Tucker's mobile showed that a number of incoming calls were diverted to his voicemail from 19:09 onwards on the 6th of December 1995. There was no evidence that he attempted to retrieve the voicemails which were left. The available cell site data for Mr. Tate's mobile suggested that the last incoming call which he answered began at 18:44 on the 6th of December 1995. The Crown relied on the timing of the various calls to suggest that the victims were murdered at some point between the end of the 18:44 call to Mr. Tate and the beginning of Mr. Womb's 18:59 call to Mr. Nichols.